As I mentioned, my name is Magdalena Tiburcio. Welcome to the webinar. Today's session is Stuck in the Middle with You, and it's a session specially designed for people who are teaching intermediate and upper intermediate students who are transitioning to advanced and may need some help and some tips to help them take that leap, right? So welcome everybody. Greetings from Mexico City. Let us know where are you from. I am checking out the chat box. The chat box cannot be seen by the other teachers, by the other attendees, but I can receive your information. So I have people from Michoacán, from Ecuador, from Colombia, from Chile. Hello, everybody from Brazil. Hi, Kelly. Once again from Cancun. Hello, Cancun. Everyone in Quintana Roo, Yucatan. Hello, everybody. How are you? Ciudad del Carmen, Campeche. Hello. Once again from Colombia. Also Venezuela. Hello, everybody. How are you? Hopefully you're having a good start of the week. I know these aren't the best times that we've had this year, but it's really cool to see you all, to see you online. Hopefully these webinars will be very useful for everybody. And I would like to thank everyone who has been involved in the webinars, all of the academic consultants in Mexico. We will have more international webinars coming soon. And hello, everybody. Let's get started. I also have greetings from Sinaloa, Peru, more Ecuador. Hello, everybody. Lots of people from Ecuador. Hello. It's really, really nice to have you online. Greetings to Ivy, if you see her around. So let's get started with the session. You should be able to see my screen by now. And I would like to tell you as well that we will have sorry, we will have recordings for all of these webinars. So if you missed one of the previous webinars, or if you do not have, if there is not enough space for the future webinars, you can always watch the recording. My recommendation, if you want to watch the webinars for the rest of the week, get enrolled now because we are running out of space very, very soon. So welcome everybody. Once again, my name is Magdalena Tiburcio. I'm from Mexico. I'm right now in Mexico City, and I am the Academic Services Coordinator here in Richmond, Mexico. So let's get started. I'm going to turn off my camera so we can get focused on the presentation. Now, I would like to say that there are over 300 people online right now, so I will try to address as many of your questions as possible. I will also give you my contact information by the end of the session in case that you have any further questions. So without any further ado, let's get started with Stuck in the Middle with You. So let's get started with this short survey on ideas related to your language programs. I will be monitoring the chat box, okay? So if you want to participate, make sure that you're using the chat box. Let's get started. The very first idea that I have here is the exit level of the language program in my institution is, and please tell us in terms of Common European Framework, which is the objective. Maria Paredes saying B1, okay, intermediate advanced, B1, C1, B2, okay, lots of B2s and B1s. So for many of you, the objective in the program is basically having a student who is able to communicate in situations probably that are familiar to them, right? Some people are saying C1 and B2. One person is saying C2. That's very ambitious and cool. Depends on the number of hours. All right. So here we have another one. the question, well, the sentence to complete is, most adult language learners stop studying English because, in your experience, what is the most common situation why people stop studying English? So people are saying because they work, they don't have time, because of their schedule, it's difficult and they don't have time. They don't have a lot of time. Sometimes they feel frustrated, lack of time, their schedule. Right. So most people in here are saying that they lack the motivation, they do not have the time, they get frustrated. So that's the most common situation you're sharing with us right now. I also have this other idea, which is when students reach a B2 or C1 language level, they usually are able to do what? But they still struggle with what? So our advanced learners usually have they can read really well, but they still struggle with writing, for example, right? So here someone is saying they're able to communicate, but they still struggle with phrasal verbs or idioms. In here, express themselves fluently. They can communicate, but they struggle with real language, all right? So some people, they say they sound bookish, right? So people can communicate efficiently, but they still struggle with fluency, people are saying. Someone is saying they are really good grammarians. Okay, so they are grammar savvies. They still have troubles with fluency, all right? Here I have another idea. The majority of the intermediate, upper intermediate language students or learners in my school would say they need to improve what? What have you heard them say? Listening skills, fluency, speaking. Most people are saying speaking skills. Alrighty. Someone said writing. Okay, so mainly skills. What you're saying is that mainly what students struggle with is when they become this level, skills. Their grammar is usually okay, their vocabulary is usually okay, but they still struggle with skills, right? Okay, and I have one more. The last one says, most successful language learners share these three characteristics. So think about your best students. These best students, what characteristics do they have? What do you think they have the others don't? Their pronunciation and listening is really good. The students reply they need more skills. Okay. So three things that they share. They are good listeners. Here I have one that's cool. Self-motivated, read a lot, and use the language on a regular basis. Okay. Someone says they are good at grammar, pronunciation, and understanding. They have lots of self-confidence. Someone else saying they process the information as soon as they learn. They are not afraid to ask if they do not understand. That's a really good characteristic of good learners, right? They are self-confident. They use the language. Someone else is saying curiosity, self-learning, awareness, and self-motivation. Alrighty. Expressing fluently, and they still have, and they have confidence, and they are good listeners. Alrighty. Good. So these are characteristics that most learners have. So let's talk about expectations from these learners. Alrighty. This is what we have. This is the Common European Framework. And we are going to focus on students who are right here in between B2 and C1. So if you are if you are teaching learners who are going into that transition between B2 and C1, this webinar will give you lots of ideas about that. If you are teaching students who will become advanced at some point, this will be useful as well. And the idea is that this is precisely the moment when many students stop learning English, because that's what we call the intermediate plateau. and the intermediate plateau is this place where not much happens. So the thing about the process in between B2 and C1 is that most language learners stop learning English at that point because they are fluent enough. They are very, very efficient so far. They can communicate in most situations. So, and the other thing is that they don't think they are advancing too much anymore. So what happens is that they stop learning, they quit the learning process, and it's difficult for them to see any improvements. So let's talk about how long it takes to go from an A1 to a C1, because it's very important that we have realistic expectations, right? So in the Common European Framework, we have 6 different levels of proficiency. They start in an A1, and then you go all the way to C2. And the idea is that it's going to take a different amount of hours, right? So to become an A1 takes between 90 to 100 hours. So an A1 is a person that can already understand a few words in English, a few expressions, but they still need lots of help to understand. Then you get the A2 level. Now, this is a very common misconception. It's not that you add 80 more hours and you become an A2. It takes another 180 hours to become an A2, which means that getting A1 and A2 takes more or less 280 hours of learning. Now, to be very honest, many of our language programs do not have plenty of time, do not have enough time, which means that students should be having contact with the language somewhere else as well. Then to become a B1, you need between 300 and 400 hours. To become a B2, 500 to 600 hours. And then for a C1, we have 700 to 800, and for a C2, from 1,000 to 1,200. So this is more or less the amount of time that takes to go from one level to the other. Yes, for many people, this information is very surprising. And the situation is that this is more or less the amount of hours it takes to go from one level to the other of instruction, having instruction that is meaningful. So it's very important that we have programs where our students are in contact with the language in the classroom, that's true, but also outside the classroom, because let's face it, it's very difficult that we can have students that spend, let's think about it, for example, I'm taking my calculator because, I teach English, I don't teach math for a reason. So in total, to become, and I'm thinking about the least time possible, to become a B1 should take around 620 hours. So that's a whole lot of time. And it is very important that we and our students as well have realistic expectations. As you probably know, for some students it's less time; they advance easier. For some students it even takes longer. So it depends on many facts, but it's important that you take into account this. So as you see, the progress in becoming more proficient in English is not a steady process that goes from 1 to 2. It's a process that takes a lot more time, and it's not always as difficult. So as you probably know, is quite simple to go from an A1 to an A2. There are lots of things to learn. But when you are a B2 and you are trying to become a C1, the work you have to do is less obvious. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We will talk about the learners who are in that transition. Okay, so let me share with you some facts about language learning in case you were wondering. The first one, after 200 hours of study, learners become users of the language, which means when they become an A2 level of English, right? So after 200 hours, they are users of the language and they can travel and start using it in real life situations. Of course, a person in an A2 level needs lots of support and help from the person they are talking to, but they can get through. So if you go traveling, at least you will be able to eat, to find a place to stay, to get directions, etc. The other thing is that most English language learners have a good steady start no matter what teaching approaches are used. So this is also true and interesting to take into account. It doesn't matter where they start learning English, the beginning will always move. At the beginning, you will always learn. It doesn't matter if you go to a language center that it's very small and focuses only on fluency, or if you go to a very academic program, everybody moves at the beginning. The other interesting thing is that many English language learners give up learning English during the transition between upper intermediate to advanced. As I mentioned, it's usually between B2 and C1 that most language learners give up. Basically, because they are already quite functional. They can use the language pretty well, right? And we also have that English language learners find themselves without a clear picture of the journey they are embarking on and the steps they will need to take to achieve their goals. So this, simply put, means that many students have unrealistic expectations about what will happen in the future or how long it will take for them to become very proficient. Alrighty, so this is interesting to take into account because students sometimes have very unrealistic expectations. I will share with you very, very quickly two real life stories. One is a student that I had many years ago. She used to work for a bank, and this bank used to have like an agreement with the language center where I used to work, and they had to maintain a specific, a specific grade for the bank to pay for their language lessons. So the student always made these very unrealistic calculations about how many classes she could skip or how many homeworks she could skip in order to to pass the levels. And then at the beginning, in the basic levels, it was pretty simple for her, but when she became intermediate, she stopped moving as planned, and this was because she had very unrealistic expectations. So she was spending very little time practicing the language, studying, etc. But at the beginning, that was enough. The thing is that she never expected that as she were more advanced, this would take more time. The other thing is, I have this cousin who has been studying a PhD for a while, and she needs to take a TOEFL examination, and she needs to score at least 500 points in the institutional TOEFL. She doesn't speak English, and she thinks that in 6 months tops, she will get there no problem. So it's important that our students have realistic expectations about what will come in the learning process, right? Yes, Ruben Sanchez, ELL means English language learners. In recent literature, they do not call them students as much. You probably remember that back in the days, they used to call them teachers and students. And now it's more common that you find ELLs. It refers to students. It's English language learners. So let's move on. This is what our students think the learning curve looks like, right? The more time you study English, the more fluent you become. That's logical. But sadly, that's not the reality. So this is what it really looks like. So you become fluent quite quickly, but then you stop, right? So as you can see, students expect that the more advanced they are, the faster they will become fluent, and it's the opposite. It's at the beginning when they are starting to learn English that they are more fluent, and then as they advance, they get stuck somewhere, right? And I call it stuck in the middle. That's what I think. So that's the intermediate plateau. So what's the struggle about the intermediate plateau? Well, your students get a limited vocabulary range. They usually use the same words, and you should pay attention between your students that are going from B2 to C1. They get stuck with the same vocabulary. They never start speaking in a more sophisticated way. Also, and as you have mentioned this already, there is a big gap between productive skills, talking about speaking and writing, and receptive skills. Usually, the receptive skills are on point. They're really good at reading or really good at listening, but their speaking and writing, it's not that good. Also, they have lots of fossilized errors, and I'm sure that you have struggled a lot with students that make the same mistake when they're speaking. Even though when they write or when they complete a grammar activity, they do it right. They don't make that mistake, but when they are speaking, they make the same mistake. That's a fossilized error. It's not a mistake. Also, the language they produce lacks complexity. So they are fluent, they speak quite well, they communicate, but their language does not sound sophisticated. It lacks this complexity of the C1 or C2, right? Also, they sound bookish. So this is a typical one. They learn English in school, and then everything they use in English sounds like it was taken from a grammar book or from a course book. And finally, learners feel frustrated about how fast their progress, not because they're moving too fast, but because they can't move as fast. And Rosina is asking, how can they get better? Well, that's the idea. I will give you now a few suggestions on how we can help them become better, right? So how do I help my students stuck in the middle to get out of the middle? So teachers usually say, my students' main problem is dealing with fluency tasks. My students know a lot of English, but it doesn't sound advanced yet. I have heard this a lot. And also, my students aren't autonomous. They do not know what their needs are. So these are common opinions of people who are teaching students at this level of English. Let's move on to talk about what we can do. So now we have understood the situation. Now it's important that we learn what to do. So our students' vocabulary is quite limited. Upper intermediate learners tend to overuse basic vocabulary. They have a core vocabulary between 3,000 to 5,000 words, which makes them very fluent. They also have limited knowledge of collocation. Someone was saying that they struggle with idioms and phrasal verbs. That's true. Collocations is something you should work a lot on, and they lack word building skills. So very good activities that you can try with your students in terms of vocabulary. Here I have one. Focus on collocations work. Do guided discovery activities where students have to figure out themselves what's the language pattern, ask them to guess from the context, and help them build dictionary skills. Now, back in the day, you used to have a paper dictionary in the classroom, but nowadays it's more common that students have access to an online dictionary. Actually, many publishing houses have chosen to stop printing dictionaries because people don't buy them anymore. They usually access online. So here's an example. I took this example from Identities 1, which is precisely a book that goes with this transition. If you don't follow Luis Otávio Barros, Luis Otávio is an amazing author. He's Brazilian, and he's one of the authors of Identities and Personal Best. He's really good at talking about advanced learners. So if you haven't learned what he has written on the matter, he's really good. And he, for example, wrote this book, right? So in here, for example, you have an activity where your students have to complete the information. And the idea here, oops, sorry, I'm back now. The idea here is that your students can guess from the context, right? So in here, as you can see, we're working with vocabulary. So now, instead of presenting the vocabulary and telling my students what the vocabulary means, the way in which you present vocabulary to advanced learners is to give them the vocabulary in context so they guess. Many students don't trust their gut, but by now they can have, can I repeat the name of the author? Yes, it's Luis Otavio Barros, right? And you can, he's got a Facebook page, I think. And identities is really made for young adults. Silvia is saying if identities is for middle school, but it really depends on your program. For many students, the program is a little bit more advanced. So for some students in middle school or secondary school already use young adult books. So if that's your case and your students have this level, that works. Now, identities is part of the English ID series. So English ID beginner 1, 2, and 3 is for people who start in A1 and go up to a B1. But the levels B1, B2, no, sorry, the levels B1, B2, and B2C1 are identities 1 and 2. So in here, as you can see, we are still presenting vocabulary, but it's work, it's done in context, so our students have to guess this. Also, you should tell your students to step up their game. So after, for example, doing an activity like this, we can tell our students as an extra, make a list of 6 words that are new, or take turns to make sentences using each of the new words. In this case, is look up, break into, third parties, keep records of, etc. Or mention words that mean the same or the opposite. And this way, our students can connect what they already know from this vocabulary with these new words, right? And we should encourage our students to actually, we can encourage our students to actually think a little bit more. Now, Flor is asking what's the purpose of the letters in red. Glad you asked, Flor. Let me go back. The methodology in identities and English ID has this feature. A typical thing that happens with people who speak Spanish or Portuguese is that they have struggles with pronunciation, with knowing where to stress the word. So the words that are similar to Spanish somehow, or they are new, they have these red letters, and the red letters tell you where you have to emphasize or where the stress is. So for example, obvious, right? Or avoid. Instead of your students saying avoid, they can say avoid. Or concern, it's concern. So the idea of this feature is to help students with pronunciation, right? So that's also really cool. That's Paul Seligson's idea. And I think it's really, really neat. Paul Seligson says that sometimes we forget about our students' knowledge of their native language, and sometimes that can help. But also it can interfere. So this feature of pronunciation was put into the book actually to help with the interference of their native language, so they know how the word sounds in English. Now, and probably you have seen this, students in these levels of English usually learn new words by reading. And if you learn words by reading, usually you mispronounce them. So the idea of having this feature is also that they learn the word by reading, but they learn how to pronounce it correctly. Rosina is asking what's the name of the book. Let me type it for you. And now, of course, both books are published by Richmond, right? And they're called English ID and Identity. So if you're interested in getting to know the book, go online and you can see some samples. Also, contact your local representatives. We are still working, so we can help you out still. Okay. Also, remember I told you that there is a gap between the productive and the receptive skills, and it's important that we mind the gap, right? So intermediate learners understand a big deal of what they listen and read. But speaking and writing seem to be static. It's not that it's bad, but it doesn't get better. So learners can't seem to transfer the language items they recognize and understand into their productive skills. What can we do? Well, every time that your students have a listening activity or a reading activity, you have to connect it with an activity that is productive. Now, for obvious reasons, I'm using examples in our books, in Richmond Publishing books. But mind you, you can do this with any book, of course, preferably Richmond, right? But you can do this with any book. If you have listening practice and your book doesn't have any writing or any speaking afterwards, you create it. It's very important that we start connecting what your students learn in the productive skills and the receptive skills, right? So for example, in here, your students were listening to people talking about musicians. And now what they will do is to talk about it, right? So it says choose a favorite album and note down answers to 1 and 6 and search online if necessary, right? So what's the album called and who recorded it, when, etc., etc. Now, if you were here, well, if you have been to our channel of the recording sessions, I gave a webinar on using the Richmond Learning Platform forum. Once again, don't worry, at the end of the session, I will tell you where you can find these recordings so you can visit the website. And in there, I mentioned that sometimes you don't have enough time to work on productive activities, or maybe you would like to foster speaking activities, and the forum can help you to continue practicing by writing, right? Something else is to ask students constantly about their opinion on this, right? So for example, here we have a feature called Make It Personal. And once again, we were reading, and what we want to do now is for our students to actually start using the language in a more fluent way, right? Let me check the questions because I think I have some questions in here. And they are saying, okay, so let me continue with the fossilized errors. We don't have much time left, but I will check most of your questions. Well, not most, I will check all of your questions when the webinar finishes, and I will send you a reply. I have your emails because you got registered using them, so don't worry if I don't address your questions, okay? So fossilized errors, what are they? These are something that students learned wrong and they need to change, or they are errors that students may correct when they are focused. Once again, many times when they have a writing assignment or a grammar assignment, they don't make the mistake. It's only when they are speaking and they are distracted. Also, errors based in native language interference or target language overgeneralization. A typical one, and I'm sure that most teachers who speak Spanish as a native language have this struggle, the problem with sensible and sensitive, right? So in Spanish, we have that sensible is sensitive in English, and sensible is sensato. So it's typical that a fossilized mistake for students is to say sensible when they mean sensitive, right? So these are the kinds of things that happen. So the idea, again, is that our students should reflect on this, right? Also, fossilized errors are mistakes that have been repeated so that it sounds right to the learner. So you've made the mistake so many times that it sounds right, right? Also, grammar and pronunciation mistakes that have become part of the student's speech. It's just the way they use it. And here I have some examples of fossilized errors. So a typical one, she don't understand what I said. People is very kind in my hometown. Actually, I'm working as a sales representative. Actually, instead of currently, right? They stole me some money, right? He didn't brought the samples we ordered. These are my favorite colors, and I am agree. That's my favorite. I am agree. So these are typical. Someone is saying that I should repeat the last image. You mean this one? So the idea is that these fossilized errors are common. They are very, very common for students. So it's very important that we address them, that we don't ignore our students' fossilized errors. And I'm going to move on, but remember that we will have the recording later on, okay? So what can we do regarding this situation to promote awareness with our students, okay? So how do we promote awareness? Well, we should beware of the autopilot, right? It's very important that we make sure that our students are aware and present in our lessons. So hi, Maria. I'm not sending the videos to your email because it's very heavy. It's impossible that it fits there, but I will tell you where you can watch the video online. All right. Once again, it's very important that we have activities where our students become aware of their mistakes. Here I have another example that comes from the Identities and English ID series. But to be fair, most books do this. So it's important that you don't ignore these boxes where we talk about common mistakes. Now, the big advantage of these books that I'm talking about is that they were specially designed for people that speak Spanish or Portuguese as a native language, even Italian. And the idea is that they focus on these mistakes and we anticipate the mistakes they can make, okay? So for example, instead of saying it was raining heavily, you can say heavy rain, right? To make it a little bit more complicated for your students. Also talking about this, the level of complexity. So students can comfortably communicate by using familiar expressions and well-known grammatical items. Now take them out of their comfort zone now and then. Not all the time, but now and then try to take them out of that comfort zone, right? So here are some examples. So this is a conversation happening in a classroom. The teacher says, Pedro, did it live up to your expectations? And Pedro asks, what do you mean? And the teacher says, was it as good as you expected? And then Pedro says, no. And the teacher emphasizes, so it didn't live up to your expectations then? And then Pedro tries, no, it didn't live up my expectations, but he used it incorrectly. So the teacher once more try, it didn't live up to your expectations. No, it didn't live up to my expectations, right? So these are the kinds of conversations that you can start having in the language classroom to help your students make it a little bit more complicated. So from now and then, choose expressions that they use or they say and try to give them the more advanced version of that. Here's another example. So Marcos, where do you stand on this issue? And then Marcos asks, what? What's your opinion? Where do you stand on this issue? Right? So in order for your students to start understanding more the phrasal verbs or the idioms or all these expressions that make a language sound more natural, it's very important that whenever you have activities in the classroom, you try to promote your students using more complex language, okay? Here I have another example of how you can do this. Here I have here I have a box where your students have to complete sentences. And on the right side, I have very simple ways to say it, right? So here, for example, in the first one, the simple way is to say, I agree. But to make it more complicated or more complex, how can I say it? Well, I can say, I couldn't agree more. Or if I say, I disagree, I want to say it in a different way. I don't see it that way, right? That makes sense, I admit. Or, okay, point taken, etc., right? So these kinds of activities can help our students to make the language they regularly use more complex. Also, it's very important to help our students have steady progress. So help your students detect their main learning difficulties. For example, if it's listening, if it's reading, if it's writing, help them plan their learning by setting SMART goals. So they are specific, they can measure these, etc., to provide materials and opportunities that promote autonomous learning, for example, using podcasts. I think that our students nowadays have many advantages that we didn't have in the past, namely using podcasts, going to YouTube. Something that I always recommend students is to watch movies with subtitles in English as well. And that usually helps them catch more phrases or vocabulary or expressions. If you are reading, for example, if you are reading the subtitles when you are watching a TV show or when you are watching a movie in English, it reinforces this part. So giving them these little pieces of advice, right? Also asking a little bit more about what they are reading. For example, if they are reading a text, asking them who wrote it, who do you think would read this? Why do you think this was written and where would you find it? And here I have an example. Once again, remember the questions were who wrote it, who would read it, why it was written, and where you would find it, right? So someone wrote this, that's what I do. And my digestion goes along okay, says Glenn Harding, world champion hurdler. So in here, sorry, we took this from this. Now, this example does not come from any Richmond book. This is a very old advertisement that you could find in magazines. And as you can see, they are promoting something. Can you say what? Right? So check it out. What are they promoting in this text? Now, if you remember, they were saying that there was basically an athlete, right? So they are promoting cigarettes, smoking, etc. So now, if we go beyond and we start asking questions like, why do you think they use the opinion? Sorry, let me come back. Why do you think that Camel is using the opinion of Glenn Harding, world's champion hurdler? Glenn is an athlete. So why is Camel using his opinion particularly in here, right? And then students start talking about, and once again, this activity was not taken from any book. This comes from an old advertisement there is going around the internet. Basically, what you can say is that students can get into it and they can start analyzing a little bit more, right? So for example, here you have another example. This is a very sophisticated lady and she's smoking, and it says Mrs. Anthony J. Drexel, third. So she has like a very posh name, of the famous Philadelphia family, has won international recognition for her charm and grace as a hostess. And this very notable citizen is saying, camels are a bright spot in my entertaining, she says. I think a meal is not complete without them, and camels are so mild, so gentle on my throat that I smoke as many as I like. They never get on my nerves, right? So once again, the idea is that our students can read beyond and they can go beyond and understand these ideas behind reading. So it's very important that we ask questions when our students are reading. Here I have another one. This is the entire page Once again, I Googled this many years ago, and this was taken from a magazine, a very old magazine. And as you can see, they are trying to make camel look like something healthy and something very classy, right? But once again, we are going beyond just asking our students comprehension questions, but really analyzing the text so they can really try to enhance their reading skills. Now, how to go about it? Make a plan. It's very important that you can make a plan. These are not just decisions that you make on the go. Okay, it's not that that as you are teaching the lessons, you will have these brilliant ideas. It's important to plan. So it's important that you plan with your institution which things you're going to do to help students move from upper intermediate to advanced. In terms of your professional development, what you're going to do to help your students move from the intermediate plateau. What are you going to do in your lesson planning, and what are you going to do with your students? So it's very important that we take into account all of these things, that you make a plan, and it's not just a plan that you make by yourself, but you try to work with students, right? And I would like you to think about the things that you have learned today and how you would like to apply them to your teaching. Now that we cannot physically see our students, maybe we can assign them more online work that can actually help them to, to take their language level up a notch. So try and help your learners with activities they can do online. If you would like to see more of the webinars, if you would like to see more recordings, there's where you can go. You can go to stage.com/channel/Richmond Teacher Training. And there's where you can find all of the recordings. So this is basically the channel that you would like to visit. Go to stage.com/channel/Richmond Teacher Training. There you will find these and many more webinars. The idea, once again, is for our students to get more benefits. So if you would like to get more ideas, for example, on how to use the forum to also emphasize this with your students, visit the channel, and there is a webinar on using the forum, the Richmond Learning Platform Forum. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Magdalena Tiburcio. I am the Academic Services Coordinator in Richmond, Mexico. There's my email, mtiburcio@richmonddlt.com, and feel free to visit our website. So if you're interested in joining our upcoming webinars, my suggestion is that you enroll today because we are running out of space. If you would like to learn more about our upcoming webinars, please visit richmond.com.mx, and there is a menu called webinars. So thank you very much for joining. Sorry if I couldn't reply to all of your questions. Bear in mind that we are over 400 people online, so it's a bunch of messages, sorry, but be sure that I will check your messages once the webinar is done. So thank you very much for joining. I hope you have enjoyed the webinar, and see you later online. Visit our channel. Bye-bye, and stay safe, stay at home.